Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of web development. I'm Sean, and in this video, we're talking about the future of responsive design. For this episode, I want you to really open up your mind. My goal is to get you thinking creatively, especially since creativity is regarded as one of the most important human skills of the future. They can automate a lot of things, but if your job requires creative thinking, it's going to be hard for a robot to replace you anytime soon. And responsive design is a great topic for your creative mind. Now, I want you to keep one thing in mind as we go through all of this. Making things faster and simpler for the user will almost always win. So for every future trend we're going to talk about in this video, we want to ask ourselves, does this make things faster and simpler for the user? So what does responsive design mean? Responsive design is about making your websites or apps or whatever else you may be building look good and work well on a variety of device types and screen sizes. I released a video last month on the basics of responsive design. It's in our series on how to build a website with your own custom code, episode 7. Check it out if interested. Responsive design becomes more and more complex as technology advances. Back in the early 1990s, when the first websites were created, when I was a toddler and many of you weren't even conceived yet, all that developers had to worry about was whether or not their sites looked good on Bill Gates' original bulky computers. Nowadays, we got people accessing the internet from phones, watches, kitchen appliances, and all sorts of other Internet of Things devices that you originally bought just to toast your bread or make your coffee, and all of a sudden they're spying on you and sharing your secrets with the government. I don't know. And that's the crazy thing about responsive design. Not necessarily that your devices are going to be used by the government to spy on you, but the fact that we as developers need to take into account all of these different ways of accessing the internet that seem like fantasy but are becoming reality every day. Users aren't just touching a screen nowadays to interact with a website or app. Now they're talking to it and sometimes even getting a voice response back. It's a whole new dimension of responsive design. 10 years ago, for example, responsive design was mainly just about making sure that your website or app looked good on a variety of different screen sizes, right? But now we have to factor in the voice element. Sometimes it's just for reasons of accessibility, which, by the way, is another big thing that you need to think about when building websites or apps or what have you, is are they accessible to people with disabilities? But sometimes voice interaction is just preferred based on user convenience, and that's what makes responsive design infinitely more complicated as we move into the future. It's going to make your head explode as a developer trying to think about all this stuff. Let's back up for a second and think about why. Why do these changes happen? Why does the way we interact with our devices continue changing over time? Well, like I mentioned before, speed and simplicity for users. One thing to keep in mind, particularly in 2020 and beyond, in a world where we're constantly bombarded by our social media and our devices and all this information, is that a lot of times less is more. We want less information sometimes, less distraction, less brain overload. Less may be more in many cases when we're trying to decide how to design things. Let's take the example of a modern website where you go to its homepage and you can't even be on it for 2 seconds before you get a bunch of pop-ups or maybe a chat bot that's supposedly a real person that's going to help you. On some sites they seem useful, but on other sites you wish those chat bots would just shut the hell up and stop bugging you. As the number and types of devices expands, so does our collective ADD and our ability to be distracted by so many different things. We as users need things to be simplified in order to do what the builders of a website or app want us to do. So then when we as developers are building websites or apps, we don't want to overwhelm our users with too many things. We want it to be simple for them to know what to do. And when you combine that with the fact that it's almost impossible to make a lot of information or a whole bunch of elements of a page or an app look good on a variety of different screen sizes and device types, it's probable that the most common best practice for user interface in the future is going to be to have a centralized, simplified user interface with minimal distractions. Very little extra information. What the user is supposed to do is going to be clearly displayed right there, front and center, on all types of devices and screen sizes. Google, for example, already does this pretty well. Now, I mentioned in my video on responsive design basics that when you're building a website, you need to take into consideration screen sizes that range from roughly 320 pixels width as the smallest screen size currently to up over 2,000 pixels width and beyond. But it's very challenging to make the same content look good on a 320 pixel screen all the way up to 2,000 plus and everything in between. So accomplishing this task can be much easier for you as the developer with a simplified, centered user interface. We as users also prefer to have to click as little as possible, or sometimes not even at all, when interacting with our devices. And this is again where voice interaction comes into play. Now, I do have to say here that even though voice interaction with our phones and other devices is becoming more and more popular, some people say it's going to totally take over and we're no longer going to be typing or touching our screens. I'm not 100% sold on that. While it is faster and more convenient in some situations, in other situations it's just not. And quite frankly, it can be a pain in the ass every now and then when you're trying to have a conversation with a real person and all of a sudden your Google Assistant or your Siri or your Alexa pops up and interrupts the conversation. You can be trying to have an intimate conversation with your significant other and all of a sudden your phone be like,
search results for "You're so sexy, babe."
And honestly, there are certain situations where it just doesn't help that much, and where users will continue preferring to just type or text and interact with a keyboard instead of talking into their devices. I mean, I don't think you're going to walk into a library anytime soon where people are only allowed to have voice interaction with their computers and phones and not allowed to type or text on them. There will always be situations where it's still more convenient to type or text. So no matter how good Siri and Google Assistant and Alexa and whatever other bots they're going to throw at us become, I just can't imagine a world where users aren't at least given the option to type or text. Users will probably be given the choice. So you as a developer don't want to put all your eggs into the voice interaction basket. You still want to learn how to build websites and apps where users physically touch their screen, in my humble opinion. Speaking of giving users choices, we already often do have choices on how we're going to unlock our phones, for example. This is where biometric authentication comes into play. You know when you just look into your phone and it recognizes your face, or you put your thumb or fingerprint on there and it recognizes that instead of you having to type in a PIN or a password? That's called biometric authentication, the automated recognition of a user based on his or her unique biological traits. Many people think that biometric authentication will become the default way that we unlock our devices and will completely replace PINs and passwords. But once again, I see this as a situation where users will be given a choice instead of it totally replacing the other thing. We have to ask ourselves that same question. Is it faster and simpler for the user? Not always. While biometric authentication can be very fast, how long does it take and how difficult is it to enter a 4 or 5 digit PIN number to unlock your phone? It doesn't take very long to begin with, so some users might prefer to just continue unlocking their phone via those traditional PIN numbers rather than using biometric authentication. So again, you as a developer probably don't want to put all your eggs into that basket. Sure, learn how to write code for biometric authentication, but also don't neglect the skill of writing code for users entering passwords or PINs into things. I mean, sure, if that becomes your specialization, biometric authentication, and that's what they pay you the big bucks for, then go for it. Be the best at it. All I'm saying is I don't think it's going to completely replace PINs and passwords anytime soon. And on a side note, biometric authentication can be programmed using languages like JavaScript, Python, PHP, all the traditional languages that you would use to write code for passwords when using websites and things like that. So you don't necessarily need to learn any new programming languages if you want to write code for biometric authentication. Now, another thing about biometric authentication that may make it less attractive for some users is in the rare case where your biometric data could get hacked. I know it sounds crazy, like someone's going to steal your face. Not exactly like that, but what can happen is that facial recognition can be fooled by photos or masks, while voice recognition can be manipulated by recordings. What are you going to do if something like that happens? If your password or PIN gets hacked, it's easy to change it, but you're not going to go get a plastic surgery to change your face just so you can unlock your phone again. Biometrics are more likely to continue being used as part of a two-factor authentication to unlock your devices rather than completely replacing PINs and passwords. And like with so many of these other new technologies becoming available, users will probably be given a choice. Let's talk about apps for a moment. Now I'm going to do a whole episode on the future of apps coming out soon, but I want to touch on it briefly from a responsive design standpoint. There's a lot of talk about PWAs, or progressive web apps. These are apps that, while instead of being built with native programming languages like Kotlin for Android or Swift for iOS, they're built with the traditional web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a lot of libraries and frameworks, of course, but they act like a website. They have a URL that you can just use in your browser rather than having to download an app from the App Store. Progressive web apps are something that I personally see becoming more and more popular, because when we ask ourselves that question, does it make things simpler and faster for the user? I say yes, for the most part. Many users get sick of having to download so many apps from the App Store on their phone, and a progressive web app gives you the chance to not have to download anything. You just click a link and you're right there, and it's also easy to share with people. You just send them a link. There's also a thing called instant apps, which you can use without having to download them onto your phone. There are low-code platforms for apps, which make it easier on you, the developer, but these are things that we're going to talk about more in a future episode. Now, a big part of this topic is making things easier for you as the developer as well. I recommend that you learn the basics of CSS. And I know we just went from talking about a future where you can carry on sophisticated conversations with all your devices and your face could get hacked, and now I'm going back to plain old CSS. But it's still important, and you should learn it along with CSS Grid and Flexbox, because those are currently the two technologies that are making it easier for front-end web designers. And those things keep changing all the time, so just stay up to date on the current trends. Now, there's so much for you to think about as a developer or a designer. It's enough to make your head explode, so how do you simplify things for yourself? Well, one thing to point out is that a lot of experts are predicting much more specialized roles within UX, UI design, and responsive design in the future. Now, I talked about this in a video last week about the importance of specialization for your future career as a web developer. Experts are predicting that we're going to have designers that specialize in web-based, app-based, VR and AR based, that's virtual reality and augmented reality based experiences. And so designers who specialize in those should have their one specialty, but then obviously be familiar with the others a little bit as well. And when you do look at the bigger picture, keep in mind that principle of speed and simplicity for the user and for yourself as the developer, because in my humble opinion, the trends that win out in the future are going to be the ones that make things faster and easier for the user. And speaking of a more convenient user experience, if you're looking to become a web developer, web designer, computer programmer, whatever it may be, online courses can be a lot more convenient and affordable option for you than a traditional university degree. I'm telling you guys, I learned web development completely online, and there's a whole bunch of subjects, especially within the tech field, that you can learn just as well online as you would on campus. Check out tomorrows-campus.com in the link below if you want to learn web development. We got a database of over 1,000 web development courses that you can choose from, over 250 that you can take for free. You do not need to spend a lot of money to become a web developer. If you're not totally committed to it, just take a free course and see how you like it. You do not have to go for an on-campus degree and swamp yourself in student loan debt to try to become a web developer or computer programmer. You can learn it all online, and more employers are hiring programmers and developers who learned via online courses. Check out tomorrows-campus.com. I built the entire website from scratch, and I learned web development completely online. Drop one of these down below if you liked the video. Leave a comment if you like. Hit that subscribe button to get notified when the next video comes out. And while you're waiting for the next video, go out there and write some bomb-ass code. And remember that chicks dig coders and dudes dig girl coders too. See you guys.